Imagine the sound of a school bell ringing across a concrete playground, the echo bouncing off red brick walls still damp from morning rain. It's 1967, perhaps 1972, and the air smells of coal smoke mixing with cut grass from the playing fields beyond the chain-link fence. Children in gray shorts and wool jumpers pour out of double doors, their voices rising in a cacophony of excitement that adults today would find almost alarming in its volume and wildness. There were no brightly colored climbing frames back then, no rubber safety surfaces or risk assessments, just tarmac, a few painted lines, and the raw, unfiltered joy of games that were passed down like folklore from older siblings to younger ones, changing slightly with each generation, but keeping their essential, sometimes brutal, spirit intact. Today we're going to revisit 10 playground games from the 1960s and 70s that have largely vanished from British schoolyards. These weren't just games. They were the social currency of childhood, the proving grounds where hierarchies were established, where you learned to run fast, think faster, and accept that sometimes you'd go home with grazed knees and nobody thought twice about it. Some of these games would make modern health and safety officers reach for their clipboards in horror. Others were so simple, so elegant in their rules, that you wonder why they ever disappeared. But disappear they did, victims of changing attitudes, busier streets, and a childhood that's become more supervised, more structured, and perhaps just a bit less wild. Number 10 takes us to a game that was less a game and more a test of courage and pain tolerance, wrapped up in the simplest of natural materials, conkers. Now, you might say conkers still exists, and technically you'd be right, but the conkers of the 60s and 70s was a different beast entirely. Picture this. It's autumn, and the horse chestnut trees that line so many British streets and parks are dropping their treasures. Boys, and it was mostly boys, though plenty of girls got involved, would spend hours searching for the perfect conker. Not just any horse chestnut would do. You wanted one that was large, unblemished, with that deep mahogany shine that promised durability. The ritual of preparation was half the fun. You'd take your conker home and bore a hole through its center with a meat skewer heated over the gas hob, threading through a length of string or, if you were lucky, a proper bootlace. Then came the techniques, the secret methods passed down like recipes. Some lads would bake their conkers in the oven on a low heat, believing it made them harder. Others would soak them in vinegar for days, or even months, storing them from one autumn to the next. The more dedicated would paint them with clear nail varnish, though this was considered a bit suspect, possibly cheating. The game itself was gloriously simple and surprisingly violent. Two players would take turns, one holding their conker steady on its string while the other took a swing trying to smash it. The sound when a good hit connected was deeply satisfying, a sharp crack that carried across the playground. When a conker broke and the victors remained intact, that conker gained a number. A owner had beaten one other conker, beat another, and you became a tour, and so on. The dream was to have a tenor or higher, a battle-scarred veteran of the conker wars that had survived countless impacts. The very best conkers became legendary, talked about in hushed tones, their owners enjoying celebrity status. But here's what made it truly of its time. The game involved children bringing in hard objects from outside school, using sharp implements to prepare them, and then attempting to smash those objects near each other's hands with considerable force. Accidents happened. Knuckles got struck, strings would snap, and conkers would fly off like projectiles, occasionally catching an innocent bystander. Blood was sometimes drawn, usually from a bit of string sawing across fingers. Try introducing that today. Imagine sending a letter home to parents saying, "Dear mums and dads, tomorrow the children will be bringing in hard nuts attached to strings, which they'll then swing at each other with considerable force. Do ensure they bring their own." The uproar would be immediate. Conkers still happens in some schools, yes, but it's often neutered, sanitized, surrounded by rules about protective goggles and supervised play. The wild, lawless conker battles of the 60s and 70s, fought in every available moment, even walking home from school, swinging your conker at street signs and fence posts to toughen it up, that's gone. We've gained safety, certainly, but we've lost something too. That particular thrill of a game where there was genuine risk, genuine pride, and the deep satisfaction of finding and nurturing your own warrior from the bounty of an autumn tree. Number 9 brings us to something that makes modern safeguarding officers reach for their guidance documents with trembling hands: Kiss Chase. The name alone is enough to make today's educators uncomfortable, and not without reason. But to understand Kiss Chase in the context of the 60s and 70s playground, you need to set aside modern frameworks for a moment and enter the world as it was. This was a game that seemed to emerge naturally in primary school playgrounds, usually around the age of 7 or 8, when children first became dimly aware that boys and girls were somehow different categories, and that awareness created both fascination and something approaching terror. The rules were magnificently simple. A group of girls would chase a group of boys, or occasionally it worked the other way around, and if you caught someone, you were entitled to plant a kiss on their cheek. That was it. That was the whole game. The dynamics of Kiss Chase were fascinatingly complex for something so simple. There were fast runners who genuinely didn't want to be caught and would sprint with real determination, their cheeks flushing with embarrassment at the very thought. There were strategic players who ran just slowly enough to be catchable by a specific person, but fast enough to avoid others. There were the bold girls who would single out the most popular boys with the determination of a sheepdog separating a particular sheep from the flock. And there were the awkward boys, the ones who badly wanted to be chased but somehow never were, who would linger hopefully at the edges of the game, running in half-hearted circles, waiting for attention that sometimes never came. The kisses themselves, when they happened, were usually perfunctory pecks on the cheek, delivered with a mixture of triumph and embarrassment, while both parties would then run away from each other, often wiping the affected area dramatically, while their friends laughed and jeered. The sound of Kiss Chase was unmistakable. High-pitched shrieks of mock fear, thundering feet on tarmac, breathless laughter, and often a teacher's voice cutting across the playground. That's enough of that nonsense. Teachers tolerated it mostly, though they'd often break it up if it got too rowdy or if someone was clearly distressed. There was an understanding that this was children working out something complicated about social interaction and attraction in the only way that made sense to their developing minds, through play, through rules, through the safety of a game that meant everything and nothing at once. But here's the thing that makes it so impossible today. We've rightly become far more aware of consent, of bodily autonomy, of the importance of teaching children that physical affection must be wanted by both parties. We understand power dynamics better, and we know that what looks like harmless play can sometimes mask genuine distress or unwanted attention. Kiss Chase, with its premise of pursuit and capture leading to physical contact, sits uncomfortably, impossibly so, with these modern and entirely necessary understandings. You simply cannot, in 2025, have a game in a school playground where the objective is to catch another child and kiss them. The legal and safeguarding implications would be enormous, never mind the parent complaints. Some schools have banned all chasing games entirely, partly because of incidents like Kiss Chase escalating or being misinterpreted. What we had in the 60s and 70s was a game that mostly existed in innocence, where genuine harm was rare but not impossible, where most children were working through perfectly normal developmental curiosity. What we have now is a far more aware and careful approach to children's physical boundaries and consent. We've gained something crucial, a generation of children who understand that their bodies are their own, that affection should be given freely, not taken as the prize of a game. But we've also lost something of that chaotic, slightly feral quality of childhood play, where children negotiated these complicated social and physical boundaries amongst themselves, with limited adult intervention, for better and for worse. Number 8 takes us to a game that was pure distilled playground democracy, where the fastest runners and the strongest players held all the power, and everyone else learned valuable lessons about survival and strategic thinking. British Bulldog. Even the name sounds aggressive, doesn't it? Very fitting for what was essentially legalized playground carnage. The setup was beautifully simple, requiring nothing more than two boundaries marked on a playground or field, and a group of children willing to risk their physical safety for glory. One child would start as the bulldog, standing in the middle of the space between the two boundary lines. Everyone else would line up behind one boundary. At the shout of British Bulldog, everyone had to run from one side to the other while the bulldog tried to catch them. Not just tag them, mind you, but actually catch them, grab them, hold them still, long enough to shout British Bulldog 1, 2, 3, or some variation thereof. Anyone caught would then become a bulldog themselves for the next round. The game would continue with more and more bulldogs in the middle and fewer runners until only one person remained. That last survivor was the winner and would often become the first bulldog in the next game. Now let's be clear about what this actually looked like in practice. Imagine 40 children ranging from small 7-year-olds to tall 11-year-olds, all sprinting at once while multiple bulldogs threw themselves at the runners, grabbing at arms, jumpers, anything they could hold on to. Bodies collided at speed. Children went down in heaps. The bigger, stronger kids would essentially rugby tackle the smaller ones. Jumpers got stretched out of shape, knees and elbows got scraped on tarmac or muddy grass, and occasionally someone would wind themselves falling badly or take an accidental elbow to the face. The sound was tremendous. Thundering feet, shouts of British Bulldog, yells of triumph when someone was caught, cries when someone hit the ground hard. Teachers would watch from the sidelines, usually only intervening if someone was seriously hurt, or if the game got so rough it was clearly dangerous, which, to be fair, happened fairly regularly. After particularly intense games, you'd see children limping slightly, rubbing bruised arms, picking gravel out of scraped palms, and nobody complained. Well, the child who'd been hurt might cry, but their parents, by and large, accepted that playground games sometimes resulted in minor injuries. That was just childhood. The social dynamics of British Bulldog were fascinating. The strongest, fastest children loved it because it was their moment to dominate. The athletic girls could prove they were just as capable as the boys. The smaller, slower children learned to be cunning, to wait for the moment when the bulldogs were occupied with other runners, to slip through gaps, to use speed of thought rather than speed of body. There was real tension in those seconds before the rush, genuine adrenaline, the thrill of making it through a gauntlet of grabbing hands. But here's the uncomfortable truth. British Bulldog was banned from most British schools decades ago, certainly by the 1990s, if not earlier. The reasons are obvious when you think about it with a modern mindset. The game was essentially a collision sport played without any protective equipment on hard surfaces by children of vastly different sizes and strengths. The potential for injury wasn't just theoretical, it was guaranteed. Someone would get hurt, it was just a question of how badly. Today, such a game is unthinkable. The liability issues alone would terrify any school. The insurance implications, the potential lawsuits from parents, the clear breach of health and safety guidelines, all of it makes British Bulldog impossible in a modern playground. We've gained something important. Fewer broken bones, fewer concussions, fewer children being physically overwhelmed by larger peers in a way that could genuinely frighten or harm them. But we've lost something too. That particular intensity of physical play, that communal experience of controlled chaos, where you learn to take hits, pick yourself up, and go again. Where physical courage was tested and celebrated, where the playground had its heroes, not for academic achievement or following rules, but for pure physical prowess and bravery. British Bulldog exists now only in memory, in the stories older generations tell younger ones, who look at them with a mixture of disbelief and envy, wondering what it must have been like to play a game that wild, that free, that gloriously, terrifyingly rough. Number 7 introduces us to a game that required nothing more than a piece of string, elastic band chain, or specialized elastic rope. and yet provided hours of entertainment while developing coordination and creativity. Elastics, known in some parts of the country as French skipping, though it had nothing to do with skipping in the traditional sense, and its connection to France was tenuous at best. This was primarily a girls' game, though some boys played too when they thought no one was watching, and it dominated dinner times and break times throughout the 60s and 70s. The equipment was gloriously simple: a long loop of elastic, anywhere from 6 to 10 feet long when laid flat, made either from a piece of elastic purchased specifically for the purpose or, more commonly, from hundreds of elastic bands looped together into a chain. Some girls would spend weeks creating these chains, begging elastic bands from shops, from their mothers, from anywhere they could find them, linking them carefully one by one until they had enough length. The game required 3 players at minimum, 2 to be the enders, standing inside the loop and stretching it taut with their legs, creating 2 parallel lines of elastic at ankle height, and 1 to be the jumper. The jumper would then perform a sequence of increasingly complex maneuvers, jumping in, out, on, and around the elastic lines in patterns that had names like England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, or chocolate cake. When you bake, how many minutes will you take? Each phrase corresponded to a specific sequence of jumps. If you completed your sequence without mistake, or without your foot catching the elastic when it shouldn't, the elastic would be raised to the next level, from ankles to calves, then to knees, then to thighs, then to waists, and for the truly skilled, to chests and even necks. The higher it got, the more difficult the jumps became, requiring genuine athleticism, flexibility, and coordination. Girls would spend hours practicing, teaching each other new sequences, creating variations, developing their own playground culture around the elastic. The social world of elastics was intricate and important. There were hierarchies based on skill, with the best jumpers commanding respect and often teaching the younger or less skilled girls. There was negotiation about whose turn it was to be an ender, because holding the elastic was boring compared to jumping, though it gave you a front row seat to watch the techniques you wanted to learn. There were disputes about whether someone had actually touched the elastic or not, resolved through playground democracy, or sometimes by one girl announcing, "It's my elastic and I say you're out," and everyone having to accept it, because ownership of equipment was power. The elastic itself became precious. Girls would carry their elastic chains to and from school, coiled carefully in their pockets or school bags, protective of them because making a new one took so much time and effort. When elastic broke, which it inevitably did, there would be urgent repairs, new sections added, the chain carefully maintained like a piece of valued sporting equipment, which in a very real sense it was. Try finding a game of elastics in a British playground today. You'll be hard-pressed. It hasn't been banned exactly, unlike British Bulldog, but it's largely vanished nonetheless. Partly it's been replaced by more structured activities, organized sports, playground equipment, supervised games. Partly it's competition from individual entertainment. Children today are more likely to have phones or devices, even in school bags for after-school hours. But there's something else, too. The culture of self-organized, child-directed play has diminished. Elastics required children to organize themselves, to negotiate turns, to teach and learn from each other without adult involvement. It required time, long stretches of unstructured play where you could get into the rhythm of the game, practice until you mastered a new level. Modern children have more packed schedules, more after-school activities, less free time in general, and less unstructured playground time specifically. What we've lost isn't just a game, it's a whole mode of play, cooperative, self-organizing, skill-developing, requiring patience and practice and social negotiation. Elastics taught you to take turns, to fail and try again, to celebrate others' success and receive praise for your own, to create and maintain friendships through shared activity. It was exercise and social interaction and creativity all wound together with a loop of elastic bands, and it's remarkable that something so simple could be so enriching and so quietly completely gone. Number 6 brings us to something that was less a single game and more a category of chase games, all variations on a theme, but we'll focus on one particular version that seemed almost universal in British playgrounds. Stuck in the Mud. The basic premise was simple, a chasing game where instead of being out when caught, you were frozen in place, stuck, until a free runner came and released you. The person who was it would chase the other players around the designated play area. When they tagged someone, that person had to immediately stop and stand with their legs apart, arms out, frozen like a statue. They remained stuck until a free runner crawled through their legs, which freed them to run again. The game only ended when everyone was stuck, which in practice rarely happened because there were always fast runners or clever, cautious players who could evade capture long enough to free others. Games could last entire break times with the same person as it throughout, which seemed cruel in retrospect, but was accepted as the fortune of the game. The genius of Stuck in the Mud was in its cooperative element. Yes, you wanted to avoid being caught yourself, but you also had to help your fellow players, dashing back into danger to free someone who was stuck. This created wonderful tactical situations. Multiple players might all be stuck in a cluster, so freeing one could set off a chain reaction of liberations, but it also meant the person who was it could guard the stuck players, waiting to tag anyone who came close. Fast runners who were good at evading could become heroes by repeatedly freeing others. The moment when a fast runner would dash in, slide through someone's legs, and sprint away just as it arrived, was met with cheers and laughs from everyone watching. The stuck players themselves would plead desperately for rescue. "Free me! Free me!" or "Someone come get me," their voices getting more urgent and more dramatic as the person who was it circled nearby like a predator. The physical nature of the game created its own particular memories. There was the indignity of standing with your legs apart, frozen, watching the game continue around you, feeling simultaneously part of it and excluded from it. There was the mild humiliation if no one came to free you for ages, as if you weren't important enough to rescue. There was the genuine gratitude when someone did come, often breathlessly saying, "Got you," as they crawled through. And there was the sensation of being freed multiple times in one game, running away, being caught again, stuck again, freed again, an endless cycle of capture and liberation that could leave you dizzy with running and laughing. The game was also beautifully democratic. You didn't need to be the fastest runner to be valuable. Clever positioning, good timing, distraction tactics, all of these mattered. A slower child could still free others if they were strategic about when they made their move. Stuck in the Mud still exists in some playgrounds today, which makes it different from some of the other games we've discussed. But there's a difference in how it's played now, subtle but significant. Modern versions are more likely to be organized and supervised, played during PE lessons with clearly defined boundaries and time limits. The wild, self-organized games of the 60s and 70s, spreading across the entire playground, with children making up rules and variations on the fly, negotiating disputes themselves, those feel less common. Today's children are more likely to have structured play, with adults deciding what game to play, explaining the rules, managing disputes, keeping things fair and safe. What we've gained is inclusion, making sure everyone gets a turn being it, ensuring that no child is left stuck and ignored, preventing the game from becoming too rough or too cruel. What we've lost is that element of childhood self-governance, where children sorted out the rules themselves, where being stuck for ages taught you something about your social standing in the playground hierarchy, where the game could be unfair, and that was just accepted as part of life. Stuck in the Mud endures, but it endures as a more civilized, more equitable, more managed version of what it once was, a glorious chaos where anything could happen, and usually did. Number 5 takes us to a game that required nothing more than a football and the ability to kick it, yet created more playground drama, more passionate arguments, and more genuine joy than almost anything else. Heads and volleys, known in some regions as World Cup or 3 and in, though the rules varied by location and by school. The basic version worked like this. One child stood in goal, and everyone else took turns trying to score from anywhere in the designated area. You had to score either from a header or from a volley, meaning the ball couldn't bounce before you hit it. When you scored, you were safe. The last person to score became the next goalkeeper. The brilliance of the game was its simplicity and its scalability. It could be played with 3 children or 20, adapted to any size of goal, from proper goalposts on a playing field to jumpers for goalposts on tarmac, or even just a mark on a wall. The culture around heads and volleys in the 60s and 70s was intense. This was the era when football was transitioning from something working-class children played in streets and bomb sites to a more organized but still passionately informal activity. The 1966 World Cup had made football even more central to British childhood culture. Boys, and it was almost exclusively boys with football, lived and breathed the game. They knew every player in the England squad, could recite match results, spent their pocket money on football stickers and magazines. Heads and volleys was where they could be Bobby Moore or Jeff Hurst, even if just for a moment. The child who was in goal had a peculiar power. They controlled the supply of the ball, could decide who to throw it to, could make it easier or harder, depending on their mood. Being goalkeeper was both a punishment, if you were last to score, and a position of influence. They could also decide whether a score counted or not, at least initially, before the playground democracy of everyone else shouting them down if they made an obviously bad call. The arguments in heads and volleys were legendary. Did the ball bounce before he hit it? Was that actually a volley, or did it touch the ground? Did it cross the line? Was he offside? Even though offside wasn't technically a rule in this game, but someone always tried to claim it anyway? These disputes could become heated, with genuine anger and sense of injustice. Sometimes they'd be resolved by negotiation and consensus, everyone shouting their opinion until the majority view prevailed. Sometimes the goalkeeper would just declare a decision and everyone accepted it, because the alternative was the goalkeeper taking their ball and ending the game. The nuclear option that usually only happened if someone had been particularly insulting or if the goalkeeper's patience had simply run out. The sound of heads and volleys was distinct. The thud of ball against foot, the rattle of a shot hitting crossbar or fence, the shouts of, to me," as players positioned for the ball, the groans when someone skied a shot over the goal, the cheers and celebrations when someone scored a particularly good goal, usually followed by a runner around the playground with arms outstretched like an airplane, imitating the celebrations they'd seen on television. Today, football in playgrounds continues. Of course, it's probably the most enduring of playground activities, but heads and volleys specifically has faded. Partly, it's been replaced by more structured, small-sided games. Many schools now have organized football clubs and lunchtime leagues with actual teams and league tables. Partly, it's safety concerns. Volleys meant children were striking balls hard at close range, and while most goals were celebrated, there were also balls to the face, occasional tears, the risk of injury that's harder to justify when you can organize something safer. But there's something else. The kind of intensive, informal football culture where every spare moment was spent kicking a ball, where children organized complex games themselves with arcane rules that varied by playground, that's diminished. Today's children have more varied interests, more distractions, more structured activities. Football remains popular, but it's one option among many rather than the overwhelming passion that united almost every boy in the playground. What we've gained is diversity of interest and inclusion of children who don't like football. What we've lost is that particular intensity of a shared cultural obsession, where heads and volleys wasn't just a game, but a daily ritual, a social glue, a testing ground for skill and courage and the ability to argue passionately for justice, even when justice was probably not on your side. Number 4 introduces us to a game that existed in the delicious liminal space between school playground and the streets beyond, a game that required a road with a curb and was therefore technically forbidden on school grounds, but was played with such enthusiasm after school and at weekends that it deserves inclusion. Curbs, sometimes called Kirbies or curbs, depending on your region and spelling preferences. The game was magnificently simple. Two players stood on opposite sides of a road, each with one foot on the respective curb. One player would throw a ball, aiming to hit the opposite curb. If the ball hit the curb directly, without bouncing first, and bounced back to be caught by the thrower, that was 10 points. If it bounced back without being caught, 5 points. If it missed the curb entirely, or hit it after bouncing, no points. First to 50 won. Variations existed, of course, as with all the best playground games. Some versions used different scoring, some required bouncing back over a certain distance, some allowed points for hitting specific parts of the curb, like the edge or corner. The cultural context of curbs is crucial to understanding why it was so popular and why it's now so completely vanished. In the 1960s and especially the early 70s, residential streets, particularly in working-class and lower-middle-class areas, were different spaces than they are today. There were cars, certainly, but far fewer of them. Many families didn't own a car at all. Those who did often had only one. Streets were quieter, slower, safer spaces where children played with a freedom that seems almost unimaginable now. Playing curbs meant standing in the road, throwing a ball across it, occasionally having to pause while a car went past, then continuing. The danger existed, but it was manageable, acceptable. Parents knew their children were out playing in the street and considered it normal. Playing out wasn't a concept that needed examination. It was simply what children did after school and at weekends when weather permitted, and sometimes even when it didn't. The particular skills curbs developed were interesting: accuracy of throwing, the ability to judge angles and spin, anticipation for catching, quick reactions. Good curbs players could make the ball spin so it bounced back at difficult angles, or could throw with such force and accuracy that hitting the opposite curb from 15 or 20 feet away became almost routine. There was satisfaction in a perfect throw, the solid thunk of ball on concrete curb, the clean bounce back, the catch, the immediate claim of 10 points. There were also the frustrations, wild throws that went into gardens and had to be retrieved, possibly from hostile homeowners. Throws that hit the curb perfectly, but bounced at such an angle that catching was impossible. The indignity of missing an easy catch and watching your hard-earned points slip away. Games could last for ages, with players so evenly matched that it took half an hour to reach 50, or could be over in minutes, if one player was having a particularly good run. The competitive element was strong, but it was also a social activity, a reason to be outside with a friend, a structure around which conversation and friendship could be built. Try playing curbs today and you'll immediately understand why it's disappeared. Modern residential streets are simply too dangerous. Car ownership is near universal. Traffic is constant, speeds are higher, and the idea of children standing in a road throwing a ball back and forth is terrifying to contemporary parents, and quite rightly so. Even on quiet cul-de-sacs, the liability issues and safety concerns make it unthinkable. But it's not just traffic. There's also been a cultural shift in what we consider acceptable risk for children. The freedom to play out unsupervised has contracted dramatically. Today's children are more likely to have their time scheduled to play in back gardens or parks rather than streets, to be indoors on devices rather than outdoors with balls. We've gained safety, unquestionably. Far fewer children are injured or killed in traffic accidents. We've gained more supervised, controlled, purposeful play. But we've lost that particular experience of owning your own street, of knowing it intimately through hours spent playing in it, of the independence and freedom that came from being out with a friend, a ball, and nothing but time. Curbs is gone, not just because we can't play it safely, but because the whole world that made it possible, the world of children roaming free in residential streets, has vanished too. Number 3 takes us to a game that was universal across British playgrounds, transcending region and social class. A game so simple that children probably invented versions of it independently in multiple locations, yet following similar rules wherever it appeared. What's the time, Mr. Wolf? Sometimes called Mr. Wolf, what time is it, depending on exactly where and when you played. This was typically a game for younger children, most popular in infants and lower juniors, roughly ages 5 to 8, though older children would sometimes play ironically or when nothing better was available. The rules were beautifully, perfectly simple. One child was chosen or volunteered to be Mr. Wolf. They would stand at one end of the playground facing away from everyone else. The other children lined up at the opposite end. They would call out in unison, "What's the time, Mr. Wolf?" The child who was Mr. Wolf would reply with a time, "It's 3 o'clock." The children would then take that many steps forward, 3 in this case. The process would repeat. "What's the time, Mr. Wolf?" "It's 7 o'clock." 7 steps forward. The children crept closer and closer with each call and response. But here was the delicious tension that made the game work. At any moment, instead of giving a time, Mr. Wolf could spin around and shout, "Dinner time!" At that moment, they could chase the other children, who would turn and flee back to the starting line, trying to reach safety before being caught. If Mr. Wolf tagged someone before they reached the line, that person became the next Mr. Wolf. If no one was caught, Mr. Wolf had to continue for another round. The drama was in the uncertainty. You never knew when dinner time would come. Sometimes a new Mr. Wolf would call it immediately after just 1 or 2 rounds of times, catching everyone off guard when they were still far from safety. Other times they'd be patient or cautious, calling times until the children were very close, before finally spinning around and chasing, creating maximum panic and excitement. Strategic Mr. Wolves would vary their tactics, being patient one game and immediate the next, keeping everyone guessing. The psychology of "What's the time, Mr. Wolf" was fascinating to observe. Younger children found genuine suspense in the format, every call of "What's the time, Mr. Wolf" carrying real tension, and the sudden turn and chase producing real squeals of delighted terror. Bolder children would creep forward faster, taking bigger steps than they were supposed to, trying to get close enough that they could reach Mr. Wolf and touch them, which in some versions meant Mr. Wolf had to chase immediately. More cautious children would hang back, taking smaller steps, preferring safety to the glory of being at the front. The child who was Mr. Wolf held a peculiar position of power. They controlled the pace and the surprise, had to decide their tactics, had to make the chase count, because if they failed to catch anyone, being Mr. Wolf could last forever, which became boring and slightly humiliating. There was an art to being a good Mr. Wolf. You had to judge when people were close enough that you had a chance of catching someone, but not so close that they could easily reach the safety line. You had to be fast enough to actually make a catch, but also strategic about who you chased if multiple people were vulnerable. What's the time, Mr. Wolf still exists in some primary schools today, particularly with younger children, which makes it one of the more enduring entries on this list. But its prevalence has diminished for reasons that reflect broader changes in how children play. Younger children today have more structured play in schools, more adult-led activities designed to develop specific skills or teach specific lessons. Free playtime has contracted in many schools, squeezed by curriculum pressures and safety concerns. The game also suffers from a problem. It's fundamentally a chasing game, and chasing games in general have come under scrutiny. Some schools have banned or restricted running in playgrounds, concerned about collisions and injuries. The specific dynamic of one child chasing multiple others while they flee in panic, even happy panic, can look concerning through a modern safeguarding lens. What if the child who's Mr. Wolf feels excluded? What if a slower child is always caught? What if the chasing becomes too rough? These concerns aren't trivial, but they represent a fundamentally different approach to play than existed in the 60s and 70s, when the assumption was that children sorted these things out themselves, that being caught was just part of playing, that sometimes you were fast and sometimes you weren't, and that's life. What we've gained is more attention to feelings, inclusion, and safety. What we've lost is perhaps a bit of that resilient acceptance that games have winners and losers, fast and slow, and that's part of what makes them games. What's the time, Mr. Wolf endures? But as a managed, supervised, time-limited activity, rather than the spontaneous outbreak of play that could happen anytime, anywhere, whenever a group of children got together and someone shouted those magical words. Number 2 brings us to a game that existed on the absolute edge of acceptability, tolerated by some teachers, banned by others, capable of descending into chaos at any moment, and beloved by children precisely because of its slightly subversive nature. Red Rover. Americans might know this game too, but the British version had its own particular flavor and its own particular violence. The setup required 2 teams lined up facing each other, holding hands to form human chains. One team would call out, Red Rover, send name right over." The named child from the opposing team would then run at full speed toward the calling team's line, trying to break through the linked hands. If they broke through, they could capture one person from that team to bring back to their side. If they failed to break through, they joined the calling team. The game continued until one team had captured everyone. In theory, it was strategic. You'd call over the weakest runners or smallest children, strengthening your line while weakening theirs. In practice, it was glorious, barely controlled carnage. Think about what this actually meant in practical terms. Children, some small and slight, others larger and heavier, running at full speed and throwing themselves at a line of linked hands, trying to break through by sheer force. The child running would often lower their shoulder like a rugby player, aim for what looked like the weakest link in the chain, and smash into it with everything they had. The children forming the line would grip hands tighter, brace themselves, try to absorb the impact. When the chain held, the runner would bounce back, sometimes falling over, occasionally winding themselves. When the chain broke, it was often because the runner hit with such force that the hand grip couldn't hold, or because one child let go rather than have their arm nearly wrenched from its socket. The children whose hands were targeted absorbed significant force. Their arms pulled sharply, their shoulders stressed. There were bruised wrists from grips held too tight, rope-burn sensations from hands sliding against each other under pressure, sore shoulders from being the weak point that broke. The drama of Red Rover was considerable. There was strategy in who you called. Do you call the biggest, strongest child and challenge them to break through, knowing they probably won't? Or call a smaller child who might break through, but will be easier to absorb? There was the tension of being called, knowing you had to run at a line of your peers who were literally trying to withstand your assault. There was the moment of impact, the test of strength and grip, the determination not to be the one who lets go and lets the runner through. And there was the social consequence of being the weak link, the person whose grip failed, which could bring teasing or blame from teammates. The game rewarded physical strength and courage, which meant larger, more athletic children dominated, while smaller or less confident children might find it intimidating or simply unfair. Some schools banned Red Rover quickly. Others let it continue for years before finally deciding the injury rate was unacceptable. Today, Red Rover is banned in almost all British schools and has been for decades, joining British Bulldog in the category of games we can't believe we ever allowed. The reasons are obvious. It's essentially a series of controlled collisions between children of different sizes and strengths. The potential for injury is enormous. Broken fingers, sprained wrists, dislocated shoulders, concussions from collisions, all were possible, and in schools where the game continued long enough, probably all occurred. The game also had a cruel edge, being called over repeatedly because you were seen as weak or easy to capture. Being the person whose grip always failed, these weren't just physical failures, but social humiliations. From a modern perspective, Red Rover is clearly unacceptable. We've gained safety, inclusion, and protection for smaller or less athletic children, but we've lost something too, that particular test of courage and strength, the primal thrill of running full speed at an obstacle and trying to break through, the satisfaction when you did, or the grudging respect when the line held firm. Red Rover existed in an era when playground games could be genuinely rough, when minor injuries were considered acceptable costs of play, when physical dominance had its place in the social hierarchy of childhood. That era is gone, and Red Rover went with it, surviving only in memories and in the surprised reactions of younger people when you describe it to them today. Number 1 takes us to the most controversial, the most debated, the most fondly remembered by some, and most condemned by others, of all British playground games from this era. British Bulldog has already appeared on this list, but there's another name that dominated playgrounds with even more ferocity, more injury, more absolute chaos, and that needs to be mentioned in any honest accounting of what childhood was like in the 60s and 70s. Except, actually, let's talk about something different, something that was less violent, but perhaps more revealing about the era's different attitudes. Let's talk about Queenie, a game that was strangely hypnotic, deceptively simple, and completely baffling to anyone who didn't grow up with it. Queenie required a ball, a wall, and at least 3 people, though more was better. One child was chosen to be Queenie. They would stand facing the wall with their back to everyone else, who lined up several meters behind. Queenie would throw the ball backward over their head toward the group. Someone would catch it or pick it up. That person would then hide the ball behind their back, as would everyone else, all standing with hands behind their backs so no one could tell who actually had it. Queenie would then turn around and had to guess who had the ball. Here's where different regional variations diverged, but in most versions, Queenie would ask questions or the group would chant, and based on the responses or behavior, Queenie had to identify the holder. If Queenie guessed correctly, the person with the ball became the next Queenie. If they guessed wrong, they had to continue being Queenie. In some versions, the person with the ball would try to throw it at Queenie's back. If it hit them, the thrower became Queenie. If Queenie caught it, they remained Queenie. The strange appeal of Queenie was in its psychological nature. It was less about physical skill and more about deception, observation, and reading people. Who was standing too still, trying too hard to look innocent? Who was fidgeting in a way that suggested they were hiding something? Who couldn't help smirking, their face betraying the secret? Children learned to school their expressions to observe tiny tells in others, to bluff and deceive. The child who was Queenie had to develop intuition and confidence, making a guess from insufficient information, living with the consequences if they were wrong. The chanting or questioning, which varied enormously by region, added ritual and rhythm to the game. Some versions had elaborate rhymes, others just had Queenie walking along the line of children saying, "You, you, you," in an increasingly dramatic tone. What made Queenie so of its era was its acceptance that games didn't have to be fair or make complete logical sense. The person who was Queenie could be stuck there for ages if they kept guessing wrong, which seemed unjust, but was just accepted. The game could be influenced by friendships. Children might deliberately guess their friends, allowing them to take a turn, or might avoid guessing someone who'd been Queenie for a while out of pity, even if they suspected that person had the ball. Teachers tolerated Queenie because it was relatively safe, no running or physical contact, just throwing and guessing, and the quiet drama of deception. It was particularly popular with girls, though boys played too, and it provided a counterpoint to the more aggressively physical games that dominated playground culture. There was something almost meditative about it. The repetition of throw, catch, hide, guess, the rhythm of the game creating a flow state that could absorb a whole break time without anyone really noticing the time pass. Today, Queenie has almost completely vanished, and its disappearance reveals something interesting. It wasn't banned like the violent games, wasn't made illegal by health and safety concerns. It just faded away. Partly it's because playground culture has moved away from these self-organized traditional games in general. Partly it's because Queenie requires a certain patience and willingness to accept unfairness and randomness that modern children, accustomed to more structured, equitable play, might find frustrating. There's no app version of Queenie, no way to play it on a screen, and in an era where children's attention is pulled in many directions, a game that's subtle and slow-burning struggles to compete. But perhaps most tellingly, Queenie was passed down through playground tradition, older children teaching younger ones, knowledge transmitted through demonstration and participation rather than written rules. As that chain of transmission broke, as cohorts of children grew up playing different games or no traditional playground games at all, games like Queenie simply disappeared from collective memory. What we've gained is hard to say because Queenie was replaced not by better games, but by its absence, by children doing different things entirely. What we've lost is that particular form of play, social, psychological, ritualistic, requiring nothing but a ball and a wall and the willingness to stand together and participate in something that had been played in basically the same way for decades, possibly generations, linking children across time in a shared cultural experience that has now quietly ended. The sun is setting on a Friday afternoon in 1973, and across Britain, playgrounds are emptying. Children stream through school gates, their clothes disheveled, knees scraped, cheeks flushed from running. Some are still arguing about whether that last goal counted, whether someone cheated at elastics who was unfairly called in British Bulldog. They'll be back Monday morning, ready to play it all again, to negotiate the same disputes, to take the same risks, to learn the same lessons about winning and losing, about physical courage and social navigation, about the informal rules that governed childhood when adults mostly left children to sort things out themselves. Those playgrounds are gone now, or rather, they're still there, but they've become different places. Safer, certainly. More inclusive, absolutely. Better in many measurable ways. Today's children are less likely to be injured in playground games, less likely to be physically bullied, more likely to have their emotional needs acknowledged and addressed. These are genuine achievements, progress that nobody should minimize. But something was lost, too, in that transition from the rough, chaotic, self-governed playgrounds of the 60s and 70s to the supervised, structured, safety-conscious spaces of today. We've lost a certain kind of childhood wildness, a particular flavor of freedom, the experience of games that had been played essentially unchanged for generations, passed down through playground tradition like folklore. The games themselves, these 10 we've remembered today and the dozens more we could name, were more than just ways to pass break time. They were how children learned to navigate social hierarchies, how they tested their physical limits, how they discovered who they were in relation to their peers. They were democratic and cruel, simple and complex, joyful and occasionally frightening. They required no equipment or only the simplest bits and pieces, a ball, some elastic, a piece of street curb. They cost nothing yet provided everything a child needed: excitement, friendship, competition, cooperation, physical challenge, and the particular satisfaction of mastering something through practice and persistence. They existed in that perfect sweet spot between structure and freedom, having rules but allowing children to interpret, negotiate, and sometimes argue about those rules themselves. Perhaps what we've really lost isn't the games themselves, but the childhood they represented, longer, less supervised, more physical, happening in spaces and times that were genuinely the children's own. The modern world has made different choices, and it's easy to understand why. Every parent reading this can imagine that moment of panic when a child is hurt, that instinct to prevent pain and protect at all costs. The institutions responsible for children, the schools and councils and insurance companies, made rational decisions based on liability and duty of care. The result is safer, more careful, more mindful of emotional well-being and inclusion. But in making childhood safer, we've also made it smaller, more contained, more supervised, less wild. The playgrounds of the 60s and 70s, with their dangerous games and scraped knees and sometimes frightening freedom, are gone. The children who played curbs in the street and British bulldog in the playground and Queenie against the wall are now grandparents, their memories of those games rich and vivid and tinged with a nostalgia for something their grandchildren will never quite understand. Those games existed in their time, products of their era's attitudes toward risk in childhood and the space between adult and child worlds, and when that era ended, the games ended too, disappearing as quietly and completely as childhood itself always does, leaving only memory and the lingering question of what exactly we gained and what we lost in the exchange.